Taehyung, shall we proceed with the ceremony? Mrs. Kim, oh yes, I will get the rings, take her to the stage. Mrs. Kim left. Tae held out a hand in front of Yn Taehyung, my lady. Shall we? Yn smiled and took his hand. Taehyung took her to the middle of the hall while Mrs. Kim got the rings. All the lights turned off and a spotlight on Yn and Tae. Both took the rings. Yn made Tae wear the ring first. Then it was Taehyung's turn. Taehyung, kneeling on one knee, holding Y/N's hand gently. Y/N, from the moment I met you, I knew my life was going to change forever. You are my light, my strength, and my reason to smile every day. I promise to protect you, to cherish you, and to love you with every beat of my heart. Will you be mine, now and forever? Y/N, with tears glistening in her eyes, nods, and is unable to speak as emotions overwhelm her. Taehyung pulls out a delicate ring and gently slides it onto her finger. Taehyung, standing up and pulling Y/N into a tender embrace, I love you, Y/N. Today, tomorrow, and always. Yn, I love you too. She whispered in his ear. Suddenly, the crowd begins chanting, their voices growing louder with each repetition. Crowd, kiss. 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 Taehyung and Y/N break their embrace, both blushing at the crowd's encouragement. Y/N's cheeks turn a soft shade of red, her eyes shyly meeting Taehyung's. Taehyung gently cups her face, his touch warm and tender. His thumb lightly strokes her cheek, sending a comforting shiver down her spine. His voice is soft, almost a whisper. Taehyung, may I? Y/N nods slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, anticipation thick in the air. Taehyung leans in, closing the distance between them, and captures her lips in his. The kiss is tender, filled with unspoken promises and a deep, abiding love. Taehyung's lips move softly against hers, as if savoring every moment. His hand cradles the back of her head, holding her close, while the world around them seems to fade away. It's not just a kiss, it's the merging of two souls, gentle yet passionate, conveying all the love they have for each other. Y/N melts into the kiss, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Time seems to stand still, and for that brief moment, nothing else matters but the two of them, lost in their love. As they slowly pull away, their foreheads rest against each other, both breathless yet content, smiles tugging at their lips. Mrs. Kim, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, her eyes brimming with tears of happiness. She gazes at her son and Y/N, her heart swelling with love and pride. But in her mind, memories of the past resurface, mingling with the present moment. Mrs. Kim, in her mind, Kwon, today, our son has found his happiness. I know you must be watching, smiling down on us. Like you found your Jiho, today Tae has found his Y/N. I wish you were here by my side, to see this moment, but even if I were to leave this world today, I would go without regrets. Our son is happy, Kwon, and that's all I ever wanted. Her tears fall, but they are not tears of sorrow, they are tears of joy, fulfillment, and peace. She wipes them away, smiling as she watches her son and his future bride. The scene shifts as BTS gathers around Taehyung and Y/N, their playful teasing lightening the emotional atmosphere. Jungkook, grinning widely, Hyung, you really had to make it that romantic, huh? Now all of us have to step up our game. Jimin, nudging Y/N playfully, Y/N, are you ready to deal with this guy for the rest of your life? He's going to be all clingy and cute, trust me. Jean, laughing, don't forget his habit of taking forever to get ready. You might need to set an extra alarm just for him. Namjoon, smiling warmly, but in all seriousness, you two are perfect for each other. We couldn't be happier for you both. Laughter and lighthearted teasing continue as Taehyung and Y/N try to respond, their faces glowing with happiness and a hint of embarrassment. The love and camaraderie between the group are palpable, filling the air with warmth and joy. But while the room is filled with happiness, there is one person whose heart is darkened by bitterness and anger. On the second floor, where Mrs. Choi, Y/N's stepmother, stands alone, watching the engagement unfold from above. Her eyes are cold, her gaze locked on Y/N, who is basking in the love and attention of those around her. Mrs. Choi's fists clenched tightly, her nails digging into her palms. Mrs. Choi, in her mind, filled with anger, she's supposed to be suffering. I wanted her to be miserable, not standing there, surrounded by happiness. How dare she? How dare she find joy when she's supposed to be nothing? Her hatred burns brightly, a sharp contrast to the love and joy filling the hall below. As she glares at Y/N, her expression twists in silent rage. Timeskip. Mr. Choi woke up and Mrs. Choi started feeding her with things. They came downstairs, almost everybody left. YN, Tae? Tae. YN, I want to use restroom. Tae, oh wait, let me call mom. YN, okay. He went towards Mrs. Kim, who was saying goodbyes to people. Most of the guests have already left, and the once lively atmosphere has quieted down. Y/N feels a nervous tension as her parents approach her. Taehyung had just gone to call Mrs. Kim, leaving Y/N momentarily alone. Her heart pounds as her parents step closer, their expressions unreadable. Y/N, in her mind, anxious yet hopeful, are they finally going to apologize? Her father, Mr. Choi, looks at her with a stern expression, but there's no warmth in his gaze. The tension is thick in the air. Mr. Choi, coldly, why didn't you tell me that Kim Taehyung is the father? Y/N stiffens at the question. Her eyes narrow as she meets her father's gaze. Y/N, you never tried to listen. Mrs. Choi, cutting in sharply, shut up. You knew your father's biggest dream was to collaborate with Kim Enterprises, yet you never told him that the CEO is your boyfriend. Why? Y/N's lips curl into a sarcastic smile as she responds, her voice dripping with defiance. Y/N, because I didn't want to? Her father's expression darkens with anger. His voice rises in frustration. Mr. Choi, I've always given you everything, and yet you're so ungrateful. Y/N's eyes flash with defiance, her voice steady but filled with years of pent-up resentment. Y/N.
Yeah.
Insults, taunts, and Mrs. Choi, interrupting with fury, how dare you make such accusations against us? We've always treated you like a princess. Y/N lets out a bitter laugh, shaking her head at the irony of her stepmother's words. Y/N, a princess. You treated me like dirt on your clothes, nothing more, nothing less. You never cared about me. You don't deserve to be called my father. Her words cut through the air like a knife, and her father's anger boils over. In a fit of rage, he raises his hand to strike her. But before he can follow through, his wrist is caught midair by a firm grip. Camera zooms in on the hand holding Mr. Choi's wrist, revealing Taehyung, his eyes blazing with fury and protectiveness. The sudden change in Mr. Choi's demeanor is palpable as his gaze shifts to the man standing before him. Mr. Choi, stammering, his voice trembling with fear, Mr. Kim? Taehyung's voice is cold and dangerous as he speaks, his grip tightening slightly on Mr. Choi's wrist. Taehyung, don't you ever lay a hand on her again. The tension in the room is suffocating as Mr. Choi pulls his hand back, shrinking under Taehyung's intimidating presence. Y/N watches silently, her heart racing, but a sense of safety washes over her as Taehyung stands protectively by her side. Taehyung's gaze never leaves Mr. Choi's, his voice firm and commanding. Taehyung, Y/N isn't alone anymore. You've lost the right to treat her this way. Mr. Choi swallows hard, unable to find the words to respond. Mrs. Choi stands silently beside him, her earlier anger replaced by unease. The power dynamic has shifted completely, and it's clear that Taehyung's presence has changed everything. Y/N takes a deep breath, feeling the weight of the confrontation, but also the relief of having Taehyung by her side. The camera zooms out, leaving the tension hanging in the air as Taehyung and Y/N stand united against her parents. Mr. Choi's hand still tingles from Taehyung's firm grip. His face is pale, his voice trembling as he tries to regain control of the situation. Mr. Choi, stuttering, as she is my daughter, and, before he can finish, Mrs. Kim steps forward, her voice cold and sharp. Mrs. Kim, your daughter? I thought you disowned her. Her words hit like a bomb, and Mr. and Mrs. Choi's eyes widen in shock. They exchange nervous glances, scrambling for an excuse. Mrs. Choi, quickly, trying to sound sweet and innocent, he was angry, mistakes happen. Mrs. Kim's gaze sharpens as she looks Mrs. Choi up and down, her voice dripping with disdain. Mrs. Kim, you look like one big mistake yourself. Mr. Choi's face turns red with embarrassment and frustration. He straightens his posture, trying to regain some semblance of authority. Mr. Choi, Mrs. Kim, I respect you, but you can't talk about my wife like that. Mrs. Kim raises an eyebrow, her expression unyielding. Mrs. Kim, and what makes you think you can talk however you want to my daughter? Mr. Choi opens his mouth to retort, but Y/N steps forward, her voice shaking with emotion. Y/N, no. No. I am not your daughter. I am only Kang Yuna's daughter, the woman who loved me unconditionally. And my mom. She was my mom. You never gave a damn about me. Just because this woman, she points to Mrs. Choi with disgust, told you I was okay, you believed her. In fact, whatever she told you about me, you believed without question. But you never asked me. You never once asked, Y/N, did you eat your dinner? Did you have a good day? How are your studies going? Y/N's voice cracks as the painful memories flood back. She takes a deep breath before continuing, her words filled with years of pent-up frustration. Y/N, I don't even remember how many nights I slept without dinner because this woman here told me that I was no one, that I should cook for myself. I was 9. I started cooking for myself, eating undercooked, burned, and tasteless food. But you never cared, not once. Mrs. Choi's eyes narrow, and she raises her voice defensively. Mrs. Choi, how can you lie like that? I always took care of you. Mr. Choi tries to smooth things over, his voice calm but dismissive. Mr. Choi, now, whatever happened, we should forget and move on. Y/N lets out a bitter laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. Y/N, is it that easy for you? My childhood was ruined, and you don't care at all? Mr. Choi's frustration grows, and he snaps back, his tone patronizing. Mr. Choi, we can't go back in time, so stop being a spoiled brat. Mrs. Kim steps in, her protective instincts kicking in. She can see the pain in Y/N's eyes, and knows that engaging with these people any further is pointless. Mrs. Kim, Y/N. Didn't you say you needed to use the restroom? Her voice is gentle but firm, a clear indication that she's ready to remove Y/N from this toxic situation. Y/N looks at Mrs. Kim and nods, grateful for the escape. They both turn away from the confrontation, walking toward the restroom together. The camera lingers on Mr. and Mrs. Choi for a moment, their expressions a mix of frustration and defeat as they watch Y/N walk away. Mrs. Kim's words hang in the air like a final blow, leaving them no room to argue. Y/N and Mrs. Kim disappear down the hallway, leaving the toxic atmosphere behind. The tension in the room is palpable as Mr. Choi clears his throat, attempting to recover from the previous confrontation. BTS, who have witnessed the entire scene, feel an uncomfortable mix of anger and disbelief. Mr. Choi forces a laugh, trying to lighten the mood. Mr. Choi, awkwardly, Mr. Kim, it's an honor to have you as a son-in-law. Taehyung narrows his eyes, his face cold and unreadable as he waits for Mr. Choi's next move. Jungkook leans toward Jin, whispering. Jungkook, whispering to Jin, where's this going? Jin, sighing, business. J-Hope looks confused, raising an eyebrow. J-Hope, huh? What about business here? Jimin shakes his head, anticipating what's about to happen. Jimin, just wait. Mr. Choi smiles nervously, trying to sound confident. Mr. Choi, this is a great opportunity for both of us. I think we should make our relationship stronger. Namjoon sighs deeply, knowing exactly where this is headed. Namjoon, here we go. The rest of BTS exchange looks, their expressions clearly showing how done they are with the situation. Taehyung, still calm but now visibly annoyed, asks bluntly. Taehyung, for what? Mr. Choi's eyes light up, sensing a chance. Mr. Choi, I think a collaboration between our companies would be profitable for both of us. Suga smirks, unable to hold back his sarcasm. Suga, a very casual way of begging for a collaboration. BTS erupts in laughter, and Mr. and Mrs. Choi's faces flush with embarrassment. Trying to recover, Mr. Choi persists. Mr. Choi, it will be profitable for both of us. Taehyung doesn't even hesitate. Taehyung, no. Mr. Choi looks taken aback, stuttering. Mr. Choi, huh? Taehyung's voice is firm and unyielding. Taehyung, I said no. I'm not interested in collaborating with you at all. Jean winces dramatically, pretending to be hurt. Jean, ouch. Mrs. Choi steps forward, indignation in her voice. Mrs. Choi, how can you say that? Suga smirks, his tone playful. Suga, with his mouth. Jungkook laughs loudly, enjoying the savage moment. Jungkook. Ah. So savage. Mrs. Choi's frustration boils over. Mrs. Choi, we have given you our daughter. Taehyung's expression darkens, and his voice drops to a dangerously low tone. Taehyung, you gave? Who are you to give her to me or anyone? Mr. Choi, feeling the pressure, tries to play his last card. Mr. Choi, we're her parents, and if you don't agree, I'll take my daughter back too. Jimin raises an eyebrow, unimpressed. Jimin, threats now? J-Hope shakes his head in disbelief. J-Hope, now that's low. Taehyung's voice remains steady, filled with quiet authority. Taehyung, it's still a no. Just then, Y/N and Mrs. Kim return from the restroom. Mr. Choi immediately tries to assert control. Mr. Choi, Y/N. Come, let's go. Y/N frowns in confusion, her exhaustion clear on her face. Y/N, Tae. Let's go home. I'm tired. Mrs. Choi's voice is sharp as she tries to take control. Mrs. Choi, you're not going anywhere with him. We're breaking this engagement. Mrs. Kim steps in calmly, her voice steady but firm. Mrs. Kim. Yeah. Sure, now you can leave, because we're getting late, and my daughter is tired. Mr. Choi's voice rises in desperation. Mr. Choi, she's coming with us. Y/N, ignoring her father, moves toward Taehyung, her voice soft but insistent. Y/N, Tae, I'm tired, pick me up. Taehyung glares at her playfully, knowing exactly what's coming. Taehyung, told you, heels aren't a good option. Y/N rolls her eyes, her voice teasing. Y/N. Yeah. You were right, now pick me up. With a smirk, Taehyung effortlessly lifts her in a bridal style. Mr. Choi, desperate and losing control, shouts after them. Mr. Choi, Y/N. You're coming with us. Y/N looks at him, her expression blank. Y/N, who is he? Everyone freezes, shocked by her words. She turns to Taehyung, her tone innocent. Y/N, Tae, is he your guest? Taehyung smirks, playing along. Taehyung, no, baby, he's just an unwanted piece of the distraction. But don't worry, you shouldn't focus on that, let's go. As they walk away, Mr. and Mrs. Choi scream after them, their voices filled with anger and frustration. Mrs. Kim turns to face them one last time, her voice calm but laced with a warning. Mrs. Kim, now you're going to leave us alone, or else. Mr. Choi, still defiant, yells back. Mr. Choi, or else what? I'll sue you. Give my daughter back. Mrs. Kim's eyes narrow, and her voice drops to a dangerous tone. Mrs. Kim, or else, I'll file a case against you for abusing a minor. And Y/N herself will testify. I can bankrupt your company in minutes. You'll be begging in the streets. I dare you to come back. BTS, except Taehyung, exchange shocked glances, having never seen Mrs. Kim this angry before. Mr. and Mrs. Choi's faces pale as they realize the truth in her words. Mrs. Choi quickly backtracks, her voice trembling. Mrs. Choi, why you can keep her, we don't need her, right, honey? Mr. Choi, equally shaken, nods hurriedly. Mr. Choi, why yes, let's go. The two of them quickly leave, their bravado shattered. Mrs. Kim, her protective instincts still on high alert, turns to BTS. Mrs. Kim, now, you all should leave too. Jimin, still concerned for her, offers kindly. Jimin, yes, but come on, I'll drop you off first. Mrs. Kim shakes her head, refusing gently. Mrs. Kim, no, it's okay. I'll go with Tae. Jean, worried, tries to insist. Jean, but he already left. Come on, Auntie, Mrs. Kim smiles, her voice soft and confident. Mrs. Kim, I know my son very well. He's waiting for me in the car. You guys go on. Reluctantly, BTS nod and head out, leaving Mrs. Kim to reunite with Taehyung and Y/N.